understand that many of you have this perception about architecture whenever this question is asked. And usually the answer comes that it's about making buildings, beautiful buildings and spaces that belong to a particular site. And that's true. And we all architects enjoy doing great buildings with this whole notion of economy that we cannot deny, that the more money you put on the building, the better and the bigger the outcome is. However, we need to question this idea that architecture is not only about making great buildings, because sometimes in some situations, it's an expensive solution. And of course, it's not about the object, but it's about the performance, the behavior, and the interaction of architecture. And it's too powerful that its impact can make a change to the world. It can change people's lives. And eventually, architecture is for everyone, for every single human being, and not just for privileged people who have enough money to make great buildings. So our role as architects is not only to build for this small particular type of people, but to build for everyone. So in this presentation, you might have this expectation that I'll be talking about a particular building embedded in some particular site, but I'm not gonna do that. Instead, I'll be explaining systems in architecture, and these systems, they don't belong to a particular site. Instead, they belong to the whole planet. Well, humanity often faces incidents that disrupt lives. Whether if it was caused by humans, by war, refugee crises made by conflict policy, or by natural disasters such as earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, hurricanes, etc., that appears to be increasing in severity quite frequently. So whether how much this is true is important, but what is salient about architecture is the recognition of millions of people's tragedy and pain. We're often not able to adapt to these kind of situations so that our lives can go on as it was. Sometimes it takes weeks, years, or it may will never be the same again, while resources in the midst of the war and natural disaster areas are exceedingly scarce and ready to use for. So in that sense, violent conflict, food insecurity, environmental degradation, and countless other factors drove more than 3 million people to leave their countries as refugees to seek asylum. And the global number of people concerned to the UNHCR exceeded the 65 million in the world. And by the year 2050, due to the consequences of climate change, the amount of migrants could reach the number of 200 million refugees in the world, and this is where they live, in slums and formal settlements. It all starts with a disproportionate number of tent shelters with a massive number of immigrants paralyzed in the local social strata that ends up eventually in shantytown communities. And the reason behind such outcome is because they're building their own shelters. And in fact, they ain't any rebuilders or architects, but just like anyone, they just seek a clean, safe place to protect them and let them build their own atmosphere, finding what they can in a resource-poor environment. So place must be made for refugees and people stricken with destruction to maintain regular life and social functions. So the problematic poses here: how can we create a system that could adapt to a population that is growing from one hand and shrinking from another? And how can we foster communal growth between hosts and the refugees? So a plant with water, it survives. And with the absence of waters, it dies. Architecture shall act the same way by creating one that survives with the presence of humans, and with their absence, it perishes. So the strategy here is to reinvent the same virus by generating the same concept. But the only difference is that the reproduced one is guided by an architect, by creating a settlement that comprises the built-in bases that refugees are incapable of building, and for them to do the squatting since they are squatters of settlements. And then they get involved in their shelters' constructions, but they have to follow guidelines and sets of construction rules given by the encoded system. Now when the crisis is over, some will leave and some will stay, so that settlement could possibly transform into another use in some other place until the occurrence of new crisis where it can be reused again for emergency. So it's a permanent temporality instead of a temporal permanence. It's perfectly a durable cycle. Proportionally, we have dual structures. We have the main existing settlement and we have the plugging components. Well, if the shelters were directly connected to the ground, they're gonna become victims of flooding. Also, we're gonna have to do some excavations to add the infrastructure underground. That's why the whole structure shall be adjacently uplifted from the ground. And also, we shall grow some perennial plants that will repel mice and small animals. So the materials proposed for the settlement is made of a metallic truss system, since it's easily transformable and changeable. But of course, it has to be locally resourced. And within the existing uplifted structure blends the central shaft, it is where the basic services take place. So we have the rainwater collector that collects water from gravity, and we have the BVs that generates electricity, and then we have the kitchen, and then we have the latrines. So those are fixed features ready to be plugged in by the refugees. And then come the floated units built by the refugees themselves, but of course they have to use locally resourced recyclable materials until the crisis is over. So this whole sophistication is based on this one cell, one matrix. Once the cell in any single scale is understood, the whole complexity in all scales are apprehended. It's made of a core and a periphery. Remember this one. So for a precarious population, a theory for the growth and shrinking is a must to delineate the matrix. So we have two distinct social structures. We have people that live in urban centers where it's mostly mixed, but we have some divisions along ethnic lines, religious lines. Although in rural areas, the social structure is a decomposition of confederations to several tribes. And inside of a tribe, we have sub-tribe, and inside of a sub-tribe, we have a clan, and by dissolving them, we have a family. Now, if you take a look at this social structure, you can realize that a single family is stimulated gradually to reach its complexity, which is pretty close to the theory of fractals. It describes the theory of nature as a self-organizing system when we explore the same pattern in different scales. So the part looks like the whole. It's a never-ending pattern. So a trunk of a tree sort of stimulates gradually to reach its complexity. Same in architecture, a line can sort of stimulate gradually to reach a very high sophistication. And since we're dealing with a population that is growing and shrinking, the theory of fractals can be the main mechanism for the growth and for the shrinking. So this system can be applied anywhere in the world by adapting to its context. So it's an adaptive architectural system. And the word context is not just a place, a whole bunch of a culture, climate, topography, etc. So in that sense, several adaptations were ideas, and today I'm going to be talking about the one in Germany. It was a competition of Project Earth 2. So in this competition, we were asked to propose different approaches towards refugees and refugee camps. You know, rather than conceiving refugee camps as storage facilities that would fulfill basic human needs and refugees as temporary inhabitants, instead, they encouraged us to zoom out to the macro and imagine these refugee camps as the cities of tomorrow, almost like a changing structure that will grow, adapt, and develop. So the aim was to bring the same identical Syrian life and integrate it somewhere in Europe that thrives for inhabitants, and to let that system reach a gradual integration by creating an open settlement that would break that isolator line separating them, sort of weaving both communities and sort of create new synergies between them and fostering new possibilities for them to be embedded within the existing city fabric. So East Germany suffers the collapse of communist-era industry, which sent workers, especially the youth, fleeing westwards with a sharp decline in the birth rate and an average age that surpassed the 45. So the smallest communities are bleeding residents, they're thriving for inhabitants. And since refugees are squatters of settlements, so it's a win-win situation. So the idea is to choose a vast agricultural area not far away from German communities and forsaken factories. That's why the site in which the project resides is in Weimar, since it's relatively fertile, and 48% of the surfaces are used for agricultural production, and it's also in proximity to several forsaken factories and leftover infrastructure. So we have some sort of reclamation for the post-industrial landscape. So the idea is that these refugees sort of squat this leftover infrastructure and bring them back to life. So their presence are going to bring positive side effect to the local communities, and the Germans can sort of benefit and utilize their skills and talents for the good. Now, in order for me to start urbanizing the system, I took a glimpse at the most affected areas in Syria, and it revealed the presence of clusters with different proportions, and they all expand radially, and they're all connected together by a network of infrastructure and roads, and in between we have plains. So in any spot, the procedure shall inaugurate in a center of gravity by expanding a radial grid to the site. Now, in order for me to create a similar environment to the one of the Syrians, in the center we created the city, the main cluster. And then we connect smaller clusters that are the villages, and then we have smaller ones. So this is the settlement. So in order for us to understand this complexity, it's enough for us to understand this one cell, because if we do understand this one significant cluster or cell, we can be able to understand infinite number of cells. It looks like the main cell in which the whole project is based on that we talked about earlier. We can see this in different scales. Now, since in Germany we're working on a more sustainable future city, the proposed plug-in components are the prefabricated SIP panels, since they have some sort of structural capacity and thermal insulation, and they're perfectly sustainable. And as for the furniture, we use reinforced paper panels. Now, there are rules and standards in which refugees shall follow while building their shelters, and these rules and standards, they're embedded and encoded within the existing settlement system. And also, refugees shall build their shelters using the number of modules according to the number of family members. For example, 69 modules is for 1 bed, 1 person, 9 and 12 is for 2 beds. and so on. So the wider you go, the higher you can get. That's why you get to see the high differences. So with the same stimulation, you can stimulate infinite number of typologies. And of course, I didn't design the shape of the shelter, I designed the process that generated me the shape. And of course, since we have 4 separate units, the 4 of them are well oriented to the sun in all seasons, and the ventilation is perfectly natural. Now, in order for me to create the main grid of the city, I removed iteration 2 and kept only iteration 1. And then again, I stimulated the grids of these same typologies. Now, the same cell is put in another cell, so we have 4 different cells in one cell, and then we connect them with small-scale services. Now, the same cell is put in another cell, so we have 4 different cells in one cell, and then we connect them with bigger scale services like kindergarten schools. So this is the main cluster of the city. Now that we understood this one cluster, the rest will remain identical. So we have positive and negative space. So in the negative space, they have to take care of the German lands for the sake of their survival. So they have to produce agriculture. So we have some sort of autosufficiency within the system. So this is the master plan, and we have the squares of rules. Now, if you zoom into the city, you can realize that we have 4 inside of 4, and the part looks like the whole. So it's self-replicating, it's self-stimulating, it's a never-ending pattern. So with the same system, you can stimulate infinite number of master plans that could be possibly built by them. It's just like a plant that survives with humans and dies with their absence. Also, the system is reimagined as an instrument of economic growth and development, providing multiple intersections for economic, social, and cultural exchange between both the refugees and the local communities. That's why, in the heart of the camp, a marketplace is created. And that marketplace would invite vendors and buyers from outside the camp to share and cohabitate the bazaar, as well as the recreational areas and leftover infrastructure. So not only does it break that caged, isolated geographies of camps, but also it would restore their dignity and create a sort of sense of belonging for them. So, and also, as you can see here, each shelter is sort of unique and different from the other, because each refugee is sort of building his own shelter. Some will put ladders here, the openings are different, some will put graffitis there. And it's also a self-sufficient settlement that comprises all the needed functions for it to survive. And the construction of these shelters is very easy, by the way, just like building a tent. And there's this important phenomenon, it's called schooling. So in the schooling, so we have some sort of corps of trained builders that will train others, and then the system will freeze. So refugees sort of should learn as easy techniques in a socially active manner until the crisis is over. So when the crisis is over, some will leave and some will stay. So these shelters, if once they got degraded, the settlement could transform into an agricultural city in Weimar, leaving the soil of Weimar perfectly fertile. And as for the infrastructure left behind, the infrastructure can be used as an irrigational system, and the PVs can generate electricity somewhere else. So since everyone deserves a clean, safe place to live, there will be a durable system always ready, so we'll have no slums anymore. Instead, we have systems, and thank you very much.